with regard to the War Powers Resolution. What my friends on the other side of the aisle are trying to do, again, is, I guess, either provide cover for members so they don't have to vote for Mr. Kucinich, or, or to make a statement, but it doesn't really do anything. With that, I reserve my balance of my time.
Gentleman's time is reserved. Gentleman from South Carolina.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield 90 seconds to the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Garrett.
Gentleman from New Jersey is recognized for 90 seconds.
Mr. Speaker, I applaud Speaker Boehner for raising this important issue today before the House. I cannot agree more with the Speaker that the President has failed to explain to the nation the purpose and goals of our military operation in Libya. The Speaker's resolution rightly demands answers from the President with regard to the U.S. security interest and military objectives in our engagement in Libya. I would go even further than that and suggest that the President has been in violation of the law and set out specific responses from Congress. But let's be clear, Congress must engage in a full and open and honest debate about sending our brave men and women into harm's way, into combat. We owe that to them, and we owe that to the American people. The Founders intended such a debate when they granted Congress the power to declare war. The President's complete failure to consult with Congress and receive specific authority as required by the War Powers Act and by the Constitution leads to only one conclusion: that President Obama is in violation of the Constitution and the authority under the War Powers Act as well. The United States Congress now cannot sit by idly any longer as the President refuses to abide by his constitutional and his legal requirements. And so, in conclusion, I believe that Congress must hold this President accountable, and the Speaker's resolution is a first step in that direction. With that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back his time. Gentleman from Massachusetts. Gentleman's time is reserved. Gentleman from South Carolina.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Nugent.
Gentleman from Florida is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd also like to thank my friend and fellow Rules Committee member, Mr. Scott, for the opportunity to support this rule. Mr. Speaker, we're already fighting a war on 2 fronts, Iraq and Afghanistan. Our troops and resources are already spent and very thin. On March 19th, the President announced the U.S. military forces had joined with our NATO allies to commence operations in Libya. The President did this only without congressional authorization, but without even consulting Congress on the matter. For the first 10 days of this operation, it was under U.S. command, before shifting control to the ongoing operations to NATO on March 30th. To this day, the President still hasn't come to Congress to ask for formal approval. When the President first committed our military to operations in Libya, he said we were talking about days, not months. Today we're talking about months, not days. Mr. Speaker, President Obama has put us in the trick bag with our NATO allies. He knew he was committing our military forces and assets to missions that would be unpopular, unjustifiable, and unconstitutional. So in an attempt to avoid Congress in Article 1 of the U.S. Constitution, President Obama transferred operations over to NATO. Although we may not be in control of the mission, there is no doubt NATO could not move forward without U.S. assets. My colleague from Ohio, Mr. Kucinich, will point out that 93% of the cruise missiles, 66% of the personnel, 50% of the troops, and 50% of the planes are estimated to cost this nation over $700 million to date. I will support our troops wherever the President sends them. However, I cannot support President Obama's decision to commit military forces and operations without the constitutionally required congressional authorization. With that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back his time. Gentleman from Massachusetts.
I reserve.
Gentleman from Massachusetts continues to reserve his time. Gentleman from South Carolina.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Gingrey.
Gentleman from Georgia is recognized for 2 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, I thank the gentleman for yielding, and I can say this to my colleagues on both sides of the aisle. I haven't heard anything from either side while I've been sitting here this morning that I disagree with. I am going to support Speaker Boehner's resolution, and I am going to probably oppose Representative Kucinich's resolution for this reason. The Speaker convinced me of that. Listened very carefully to him in regard to, within 2 weeks, pulling everything that we have in Libya out and coming home would be a dangerous precedent in regard to our NATO allies. Make no mistake about it, this president got us into this mess. It was his ignoring of the War Powers Resolution Act. I don't know who was advising him in regard to that, whether it was the Attorney General, but it was an absolute mistake. But now that he has committed us, the United States of America, and our troops to NATO through this UN resolution, I feel that it would be a mistake to immediately, within 14 days, pull the rug out from under that operation. I'm not completely satisfied with the Boehner resolution, but I think it does, Mr. Speaker, lay down a marker. It makes a statement. And the Speaker was very clear in speaking to us that this is not the end of this. This is the beginning. We have the ability to, if we need to amend the War Powers Resolution. We need to make it very clear. I don't know who the President notified in regard to this operation. What did he do? Send a tweet to the chairman of the Senate and House Armed Services Committee and the respective select committees on intelligence? That's not good enough for me, a member, one of 435 in this body. It should never happen again, and that's what this is all about today. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I'll yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back his time. This gentleman from Massachusetts, continue to reserve.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Indiana, Mr. Burton.
Gentleman from Indiana is recognized for 2 minutes.
Let me say that this is not a partisan issue. I hear a lot of partisan rhetoric, but it's not a partisan issue. This is an issue about where we deploy troops, who has the authority to do it, and whether or not what the President has done is constitutional. One of the concerns that I have, and I'll probably support both resolutions, but one of the concerns I have about the Speaker's resolution is it says the President shall not deploy, establish, or maintain the presence of units and members of the United States Armed Forces on the ground in Libya. Now, most of our wars that we fight now are fought from the air or from battleships. We've had about 250 missiles fired in Libya, and about 226 of them are American. We've spent almost $750 million already, and it probably will go over $1 billion. Now, boots on the ground says that we're not going to put troops into Libya, but we've got ships offshore, we've got planes in the air, we've got airmen who are at risk every single day, and we're committing military forces in Libya even though we don't have boots on the ground. This goes further than boots on the ground. The President does not have the constitutional authority to do what he did. Now, I think that the Boehner resolution is a good step in the right direction, except for one thing. It limits it to no boots on the ground. We shouldn't have any troops over there. This was not approved by Congress, by the people. It was approved by the Arab League. It was approved by the United Nations. It was approved by the French and the English, but not the American people. And it's costing billions of dollars, or will cost billions of dollars. This is something that should not have happened, and it should never happen again. Now, if we limit this to boots on the ground, what if the President decides in a week while we're out on recess to go into Syria? And they say, well, it says no boots on the ground. He could still attack Syria, Assad there in Syria, with airplanes and missiles. We must stop this President from making unilateral decisions that the American people do not support and the Congress of the United States does not support.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman from Massachusetts.
Ready to
Gentleman
close?
from South Carolina.
We're ready to close. We reserve.
Gentleman from Massachusetts.
Mr. Speaker, how much time do I have remaining?
Gentleman has 5 minutes remaining.
Okay. I yield myself the balance of the time.
Gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, this is a very serious issue, and I want to commend many of my colleagues who have come to the floor today who have spoken very thoughtfully and about this issue. But on this issue, quite frankly, we should have come together in a bipartisan way and crafted a bipartisan resolution and come to this floor as one and spoken as one. That did not happen because politics got in the way. You know, any time over the last several weeks, the Armed Services Committee or the Foreign Affairs Committee could have reported out a resolution on Libya. They didn't. Mr. Kucinich came to the floor with, came to the House with his resolution, went through a process that would have compelled a vote, and all of a sudden, the Republican leadership got nervous and they came up with the Boehner resolution in an attempt to undercut the Kucinich resolution. If you question whether or not politics had anything to do with it, I'd advise you to read the Politico piece that ran, and when Boehner, it quotes, and I quote, Boehner told the House Republican Conference during a closed-door meeting on Thursday that he doesn't want to turn the floor over to Dennis Kucinich, the liberal Ohio Democrat who has been a driving force against the administration's military action in Libya. Okay, I get it. But you know what? We could have come together, and the chairman and the ranking member of the Armed Services Committee, the chairman and the ranking member of the Foreign Affairs Committee could have come together, and we could have crafted a bipartisan resolution and done something truly meaningful here. Because, quite frankly, it doesn't matter what political party a president may be, it needs to be made clear that Congress plays a role in war-making. And unfortunately, in this case, I think there's a bipartisan consensus that Congress was just ignored. And that cannot stand. My problem, again, with the Boehner resolution is that it doesn't do anything. If anybody thinks that passing this resolution is going to compel the White House to do anything differently or provide us with anything that they haven't already provided us with, they're gravely mistaken. It doesn't force the President or administration to do anything. It's a strong statement. I think it's a little bit is written in a very partisan way, unfortunately, but my friends on the other side of the aisle can do what they want. But it reminds, I think, all of us who care deeply about these issues that there has to be a better way to do this. And on issues like this, we should come together in a bipartisan way and try to craft resolutions or joint resolutions that mean something and that both sides can feel comfortable supporting. I would also, again, want to thank my colleagues on both sides of the aisle for reminding us again the importance of the War Powers Resolution. It is not just some mere resolution. I mean, it is law. It is law. And the reason why we are here today is because we believe that the War Powers Resolution needs to be upheld and that Congress needs to assert its proper role on this issue. So, having said all of that, I will urge my colleagues to vote no on the rule, because I think this process is not appropriate. I would urge my colleagues to vote no on the Boehner resolution, and I will vote for the Kucinich resolution. I would urge my colleagues to vote their conscience on that. But if you really want to send a statement, if you really want to send a message, let's send a message. Let's not send a press release. Let's do something that resonates, that once again asserts Congress's proper role in this debate. We're involved in too many wars. We're going broke. We're losing too many brave men and women in these conflicts. And in the case of Libya, I, like many of my colleagues on both sides of the aisle, wonder what the point is and what our mission is. It's not clear. That's one of the reasons why Congress should be involved. That's one of the reasons why there should be debate. We need to take this out of the realm of partisanship and kind of return it back to where it belongs. This should be a bipartisan issue here. And I regret that my colleagues on the other side of the aisle chose not to do that. So I would urge a no vote on the rule, a no vote on the Boehner resolution. I will vote for the Kucinich resolution. I urge my colleagues to vote their conscience on that. With that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back his time. Gentleman from South Carolina.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This rule lets the House work its will, without any question. You have choice. Take it, the opportunity, vote your conscience. This is a place where we are confident and not nervous. But we want to close in a bipartisan way, because there's no doubt that we want Americans to come together, and I can think of no more appropriate way to close than to quote then Senator Barack Obama once again. The President does not have the power under the Constitution to unilaterally authorize a military attack in a situation that does not involve stopping an actual or imminent threat to the nation. I yield back the balance of my time, and I move the previous question on this resolution.
Gentleman yields back his time. Without objection, the previous question is ordered. The question is on adoption of the resolution All those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. The ayes have it. The resolution is adopted, and without objection, motion to reconsider is laid upon the table.
Mr. Speaker,
Gentleman from Massachusetts.
I ask for the yeas and nays.
Yeas and nays are requested. Those favoring a vote by the yeas and nays will rise. Sufficient number having risen, the yeas and nays are ordered. Members will record their votes by electronic device.
The U.S. House today is beginning debate on two resolutions on the use of U.S. forces in the Libyan conflict and the underlying issues behind that, the involvement of the President, the role of the President, and the role of Congress in that. Two resolutions to be debated, one rule to cover both. One resolution, which was proposed yesterday by House Speaker John Boehner, and the other by Dennis Kucinich, which was proposed earlier in the week, intended to be brought forth to the floor on Wednesday of this week, but now here on the floor today. Both will be covered by the same rule. Both of those resolutions will get an hour of debate, so that's ahead here on the House floor. They're voting on the rules, so the initial debate underway. Joining us is Russell Berman, who writes for The Hill and covering the debate on the Libyan resolution. Russell Berman, how do these two resolutions differ?
Well, principally, the Kucinich resolution would have the force and effect of law. It would require, if it passed the House and the Senate, it would require the President to withdraw military forces from Libya within 15 days. The Speaker Boehner's resolution is essentially a sense of the House resolution. It demands a lot of information from the White House, and it sort of notes that Congress has not authorized the mission and is not authorizing the mission here. But you know, the criticism from Democrats who support the Kucinich resolution is that the Boehner resolution doesn't force anything, doesn't really do anything. Jim McGovern of Massachusetts likened it to a press release. So it would certainly send a message to the White House and to the President, but it would not necessarily force any action from the administration.
Back up just a minute on how we got to this position in the U.S. House. Dennis Kucinich proposed this resolution earlier in the week, and then what happened to his proposal?
Well, it all came very quickly to the fore because Dennis Kucinich proposed his resolution under a procedures under the War Powers Resolution, which provide for a fast-tracking procedure for withdrawal resolutions. So he got the attention of the Republican leadership, and they needed to schedule a vote on it either this week, or if they didn't do that, then Kucinich could force a vote on it when the House returned from recess next week. Now, the Republicans had scheduled a vote on this for Wednesday, thinking, well, it'll get voted down and we'll be done with that. But then they learned from, when talking to members of their conference, that there was actually a lot of support for the Kucinich resolution because members were still quite angry with the White House and the administration for a lack of consultation with Congress over Libya. And so the Speaker and Republican leaders were fearful that this resolution would pass, and it would send a much stronger message to not only the White House but the international community and the U.S. Allies in NATO than they wanted to send. And so they scrambled to draft a resolution of their own that could siphon off many of these Republican votes from the Kucinich resolution and give Republicans a way to register their disapproval with the White House, demand more information on the Libyan mission, but stop short of directing an immediate withdrawal of American troops, which many Republicans are expected to oppose.
Well, on this lack of consultation with the White House, both parties met with the President this week about the debt. Did the issue of Libya come up at all in either of those meetings?
Well, we hear it came up briefly with Eric Cantor, the majority leader, essentially telling the White House that there's a lot of consternation and a lot of anxiety in the Republican conference about the Libyan mission and sort of the amount of information that is being provided. But it was not a primary topic of that conversation.
Are we going to see any related action, similar action in the Senate?
Well, in the Senate, the politics are a bit different there. If you remember, the White House asked for, on May 20th, they sent a letter endorsing a resolution, a bipartisan resolution in support of the Libya mission that was sponsored by Senator John Kerry, the chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, Senator John McCain, the top Republican on the Armed Services Committee. That resolution, Harry Reid has said it will get a vote sometime this month after the Senate returns from its recess this week. It's not clear exactly how much support it has, but it has support among bipartisan foreign policy leaders in the Senate. So it's not likely, for example, that this resolution the House is passing, would go really anywhere in the Senate. I would not expect Harry Reid to bring it up, although they are expected to act on some sort of Libya resolution when they come back, and it's possible that critics of the mission could try to bring up an amendment similar to what the Boehner or Kucinich resolution would do.
Already some strange bedfellows in terms of support for either resolution. You write about the fact that Dennis Kucinich told The Hill that he intends to vote for the Boehner resolution. So if you had to handicap either resolution and the vote later today, what do you see happening?
Well, I would expect the Boehner resolution to pass, although Democrats other than Dennis Kucinich, Nancy Pelosi, and Mr. McGovern of Massachusetts, who is also a leader in the sort of criticism of the Libya mission, they've said that they're not going to support the Boehner resolution. So that vote could fall a bit more on partisan lines. And it's possible that it could be pretty close because there might be some Republicans who simply who are more supportive of the Libya mission and don't want to send such a critical message to the president on this. I would expect that the Kucinich resolution would fail because it seems after his conference meeting yesterday that John Boehner has won over many of the Republicans who were sympathetic to the Kucinich resolution. Mm-hmm. Many of them will now support his resolution and oppose. So I would expect the Boehner one to pass and the Kucinich one to fail, although that's not a 100% prediction there.
Russell Berman keeping an eye on the debate over the Libyan resolutions. You can follow his stories online at thehill.com. Thank you for that update.
Thanks so much.
On the House floor now, they're voting on the rule for both of these resolutions, the Boehner resolution and the Kucinich resolution. We're going to open up our phone lines here for your thoughts on U.S. policy. Should the U.S. military be involved in the Libyan operation? Here are the numbers to call. If you're a Republican, it's 202-585-3885. Democrats, 202-585-3886. Independents and others, 202-585-3887. Again, still plenty of debate ahead. This is the first vote of the day, the first recorded vote. It's 15 minutes, so we have time to take your thoughts and comments if you want to call in. Make sure, though, that if you do call in, to turn down your television or radio so you don't feed back, and don't call if you've called us in the last 30 days or so. Well, the issue of Libya came up in the form of a amendment yesterday to Homeland Security, the first of the 12 spending bills that the House is taking up. An amendment by Brad Sherman of California, which would have prevented funds in the Homeland Security bill for 2012 to be used in Libya, and that fell just short of passage. It was 208 to 213 yesterday. Let's go to Washington, D.C. Saba is on our Republican line. You're first up. What are your thoughts?
I completely disagree with the whole war effort in Libya from the start. I don't think we should have gone to war, and we've been wasting millions of dollars, and the whole effort has been a disaster. From my perspective, China, India, all the other larger world economies aren't sending their troops for every other human rights violation. Why are we wasting our money and also lives that have been lost since the conflict started over 2 months ago? We should be ending this war and bringing our troops, all troops home.
Here's Ames, Iowa. Barbara on our Democrats line. Good morning.
Good morning. I agree with what the woman that was before me said about getting out of all the wars. I believe that we are wasting money. I agree with both of the resolutions, both the Kucinich and the Boehner. Even though the Boehner resolution may not have the force of law, it still makes a statement. But I think both of them should be passed. I do believe we should be out of Libya.
The New York Times writes that if either or both were to pass, it would represent the most assertive stance by Congress to date on the Libya conflict and highlight the chronic tensions between the executive and legislative branches over the president's ability to wage war without Congress's express approval. The U.S. is currently providing NATO with intelligence, logistical support, and armed drones in what is largely a bombing campaign against Libyan government forces. Next up is North Babylon, New York. Elizabeth is on the Republican line there. Go ahead.
Yes, I support either one of the resolutions because the president did a very wrong thing by not coming to Congress. And even what he did do, he should have never sent the letter. He should have came in person if that's the way he felt and had to hear what the Congress had to say. We are the people.
In Danville, Illinois, Independent Line, this is Kirk. Hi there.
Hi. Hey, I don't think that we really need resolutions per se because the War Powers Act, which is law, states that he cannot go over 60 days. Now, if we're still doing bombings, that is a war act, and therefore he is unconstitutionally taking the military into war actions.
The Associated Press writes about the 1973 War Powers Resolution. It requires the president to obtain congressional authorization within 60 days of the start of military operations, a deadline that passed last month. Previous presidents, writes the AP, Republicans and Democrats, have largely ignored the law. Rensselaer, New York is next up on our Democrats line. Nicholas, hi there.
Hi. I would like to say I was watching this debate with Mr. Boner's resolution and Mr. Kucinich's, and right here where I live, a lot of us is out of work, and what we would like to see is that this resolution be resolved in favor of giving time for the bipartisan, which the man was talking about bipartisanship from Massachusetts, the rep from Mass. And I like that bipartisan idea very, very much because we would like to see a bipartisan solution to our country's problems so that there's time for all of us to sit back and not lose any more relatives to war and hope that our relatives returned home to the Bethesda Hospital, where the people go home to Bethesda and they can be fitted up for the they can be fitted up and helped.
The thoughts of Nicola from Rensselaer, New York. Just a reminder, folks, make sure you mute your television or radio when you do call in. Russell Berman from The Hill, we just spoke with, wrote this morning that Boehner's resolution does not say the president had violated the 1973 law requiring congressional authorization of military operations, but it does note the administration did not seek authorization, nor has Congress granted it. And that's from Russell Berman this morning in The Hill. You can read it at thehill.com. We'll go next to Charleston, South Carolina. Kwame. Kwame,
yes.
I can hear that you've got your television or radio up. Just hit the mute button and go ahead with your comments there.
How you doing, sir?
Doing fine.
Okay. I support Obama all the way. What he's doing, no matter what he's doing, we're in UN. What about Bush? Did his thing about Iraq? So, can't knock nobody what he's doing. He's trying to do so.
Okay, but on these specific debate, here you have a Republican resolution and a Democratic resolution by Dennis Kucinich. Do you think that either of them are right? Do you think that the president has a responsibility, one, to seek authorization from Congress for this operation?
He don't need to. I don't think he needs to.
Little Sound, Pennsylvania. Frank, on our Democrats line, go ahead with your comments.
Yeah, my comment is that they ended the space program this year. Apparently we can't afford to have a space program anymore, but yet we can afford to be in Libya. The TSA has a yearly budget this year of $8.1 billion, which is just completely ridiculous. It doesn't cost $8.1 billion to stick your hands down people's pants. And this is what we're doing instead of you know, trying to keep our superpower status. I mean, how much longer can the United States possibly remain a superpower when we're throwing money down the toilet like this?
Frank mentioned the TSA. Their budget, the Homeland Security budget, was passed by the House yesterday, so that's the first of the 2012 spending bills. They got to work on the Military Construction and Veterans Affairs bill, but they will continue work on that next week. They won't finish that up today. Today devoted to the two resolutions on the use of U.S. forces in the Libyan conflict, and this on the House floor is a vote on the rule for consideration of those two resolutions. This is May unemployment numbers come out, and we're hearing a number of comments from members of the House and Senate, particularly in the House. In fact, John Boehner and Eric Cantor held a brief news conference earlier today, and we'll show that later in our schedule. You can also see that online at cspan.org. Also online, you'll be able to see the President's comments later today. The President is heading to Toledo, Ohio. He'll be speaking at a Chrysler supply company. This is Treasury announcing yesterday that it has reached an agreement to sell its remaining stake, its 6% stake in Chrysler. According to the Washington Post, the U.S. has recovered about 90% of the rescue money given to Chrysler. That speech by the President comments in Toledo, 1:25 Eastern, and that'll be online at cspan.org, also C-SPAN 3. Here's San Antonio, Texas. Next up is Juan, Independent Line.
Yes, I'm calling in because two resolutions Speaker Boehner and Congressman Kucinich submitted. What's really troubling is that the arrogance of this president causing Speaker Boehner and Congressman Kucinich to even come up with the resolutions forcing him to abide by the Constitution. It's astonishing to me how he can, for a president that was in college as a professor, as a constitutional knowledgeable, is completely at a loss at what his rights or his duties and responsibilities are, and they continue to fail. I support both resolutions, and what's more tragic is that it had to be done to curtail his arrogance.
Thanks, Juan. One more call here. Let's go to Long Island. And Chris calling in, Republican line.
Hi. I'm not really sure what the difference is between the Boehner and the Kucinich resolution. If I can get more clarification on that or where I can read it. But what I'd like to say, the comment that the 2 or 3 callers away said that the president does not need to have authorization. I don't care if the president is Republican or Democrat. This country is founded on the Constitution. We have laws. And if our very president, whether he's a Democrat or Republican, does not follow our Constitution, does not take it seriously, our country is in danger, because that's what keeps our freedoms. That's what keeps us from becoming China or Iran or Iraq, is that we are based on constitutional law. I don't see any reason why we should be in Libya. Unless we are protecting our country, we need to get out.
Well, Chris, thanks for that call. Here's how Russell Berman differentiates between the two. He says that Boehner's proposal would forbid the deployment of U.S. ground troops and demand that Obama provide information on 21 separate related items to the mission within 14 days, including the mission's goals and objectives, its cost, and the president's justification for not seeking congressional authorization. He writes that Dennis Kucinich's resolution would require the U.S. to withdraw its forces from Libya within 15 days. Still some time left on this vote, so we're going to take you to a news conference, show you at least part of a news conference with John Boehner and Eric Cantor reacting to the news this morning on the May unemployment figures, the unemployment rate ticking up to 9.1%. We'll show you what we can until the vote wraps up.
It's clear from this morning's jobs report that the economy still isn't creating enough jobs. You talk to job creators around the country like we have, they'll tell you that the overtaxing, overregulating, and overspending that's going on here in Washington is creating uncertainty and holding them back. This week, House Republicans met with the President, urged him to change course and to work with us on our plan for new jobs and economic growth in our country. And we hope he'll take us up on our invitation. We're serious about creating jobs in America. We can't raise taxes on the very people who create jobs and keep spending money that we don't have. Yesterday, Moody's reinforced our point with that an increase in the debt limit without major spending cuts will hurt our economy and destroy jobs. That's why we've said the spending cuts must increase or must accompany any increase in the debt limit. One look at the jobs report should be enough to show the White House it's time to get serious about cutting spending and dealing with our ailing economy.
Good morning. If there were ever a time that we need to start focusing on jobs, this is it. If there were ever an indicator that we actually need to start having a plan to grow jobs, this is it. And the House Republicans unveiled our plan for America's job creators last week. We are serious about growing this economy. We are serious about reinstilling some optimism on the part of small businesses and the middle class in this country. This president continues to give speeches as if he is there for the middle class and the small businesses, but somehow the rhetoric falls short because the actions have seemed to hinder job growth and entrepreneurial activity. We want to continue to push forward in this area and welcome the president finally to join us so that we can get America back to work.
You heard from the Speaker and the leader on the facts that were out there. One of the things when you look at the jobs report, you sit back and wonder why. You saw a Keynesian view of more government spending from a stimulus to a QE1 and QE2. Not only did the voters disagree with it, now the numbers have disagreed with it. Today it takes the average unemployed 39.7 weeks to find a job. You have been 28 straight months with unemployment above 8%. You look back and wonder why. It's been more than 750 days and the Democrats have not passed the budget. Why would you wait without a long-term plan? This is a time for Harry Reid. This is a time for the president to put the partisanship aside and put the country first. There are a number of bills the House Republicans have passed to roll back regulations, to focus on small business. 70% of all new jobs start through small business. Let's put people before politics, and let's put this country back to work.
Well, another month and another data point on the failure of Obamonomics. The administration still doesn't seem to understand that you cannot spend, borrow, tax, and bail out your way to economic prosperity. If you look at the history of recessions in the post-war era, you have never seen a longer recession attached to a more tepid recovery than that which is occurring under President Barack Obama. By any historic standard, this nation ought to be back to work. There ought to be more money in the pockets of American families to send their kids to college, to start a small business, but there isn't. Again, it is another data point on their failure. It's one of the reasons why just last week, as our leader said, Republicans announced their plan for America's job creators. What the administration doesn't understand that one of the biggest impediments to job creation today is the lack of confidence. A lack of confidence in the future that comes from an administration where regulators have gone wild, from an administration threatening the largest single tax increase in America's history, in an administration that doesn't take seriously the debt that is threatening our job creators, threatening our national security, and threatening future generations. Our job creators...
The nays are 156. The resolution is adopted. Without objection, a motion to reconsider is laid on the table. For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Florida seek recognition?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Pursuant to House Resolution 294, I call up
Member ought to sit down and listen to this debate.
Gentlemen, it's correct. The House is not in order.
Thank you, Dan Bulletin. Thank you, my man.
Would all members respectfully take their seats? Would all members please take their seats or take your discussions outside the House chamber? For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Florida seek recognition?
Thank you so much, Mr. Speaker. Pursuant to House Resolution 294, I call up House Resolution 292 and ask for its immediate consideration.
The clerk will report the title of the resolution.
House Resolution 292, resolution declaring that the President shall not deploy, establish, or maintain the presence of units and members of the United States Armed Forces on the ground in Libya and for other purposes.
Pursuant to House Resolution 294, the resolution is considered read. The resolution shall be debatable for 1 hour, with 40 minutes equally divided and controlled by the Chair and Ranking Minority Member of the Committee on the Foreign Affairs, and 20 minutes equally divided and controlled by the Chair and Ranking Minority Member of the Committee on Armed Services. The gentlewoman from Florida, Ms. Ross-Lehtinen, and the gentleman from California, Mr. Berman, each will control 20 minutes. The gentleman from California, Mr. McKeon, and the gentleman from Washington, Mr. Smith, each will control 10 minutes. The Chair recognizes the gentlewoman from Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to yield myself such time as I may consume.
The lady is recognized.
Thank you. I rise in strong support of House Resolution 292, sponsored by our distinguished Speaker. As the resolution states at the outset, the armed forces of the United States may only be used to defend and advance the national security interests of the United States, not to enforce, to quote the President, quote, the writ of the international community, end quote, nor because of the United Nations, nor because of the Arab League. Yet these are what the President has repeatedly pointed to in justifying sending U.S. forces into action in Libya. But what he has not done is explain to the American people and to Congress how the situation in Libya, if allowed to spiral out of control, poses a threat to U.S. national security interests. It is an increasingly important region, Mr. Speaker, with implications stretching into other areas that are vital to our nation. Little, if any, details have been provided in response to repeated questions regarding U.S. goals, the cost of the operation, the scope of the operation, and other issues of direct relevance to our national security. It is an open question as to whether the administration simply won't tell us or whether they just don't know the answers. Members on both sides of the aisle are increasingly frustrated, and I share that frustration. Many question the importance of Libya to U.S. interests, and especially the need for military engagement. Many more are outright angry about the disregard with which the President and his administration have treated Congress on the Libya military engagement. But it is not surprising that there is a desire to simply say enough and to force the President to withdraw precipitously, regardless of the consequences. But I believe that we would only make a difficult situation worse by taking such drastic action. The negative impact would be widespread, Mr. Speaker. The news that the U.S. House of Representatives had mandated a withdrawal of U.S. forces would send a ray of sunshine into the hole in which Gaddafi is currently hiding. It would ensure his hold on power. It would be seen not only in Libya, but throughout the Middle East and North Africa as open...
We shall suspend. The House is not in order. Out of respect for the gentlelady, please take your sidebar discussions outside the House chamber. Gentlelady may resume.
I thank the Speaker. It would be seen not only in Libya, but throughout the Middle East and North Africa as open season to threaten U.S. interests and destabilize our allies. Pulling out of the NATO operation would also undermine our NATO partners, who, after years of prodding by us, have finally begun to take more responsibility for ensuring security and stability in the region. How could we then argue that they must maintain their commitment to our allied efforts in Afghanistan when we have just pulled the rug out from under them in Libya? We must not let our frustration with the President's contempt for Congress cloud our judgment and result in our taking action that would harm our standing, our credibility, and our interest in the region. But clearly, we must speak out. This resolution offered by Speaker Boehner would send an unambiguous warning to the President that he must either change course in his dealings with Congress and the American people, or have the decisions regarding U.S. involvement in Libya taken out of his hands. It states a fundamental truth that I assume most in this chamber agree with, that U.S. forces must only be used to defend and advance the national security interests of the United States. It underscores that the President has not made a compelling case for U.S. military involvement based on U.S. interests, and it prohibits the deployment of U.S. ground forces in Libya so that mission creep would not gradually lead us into an ever-expanding conflict. It also requires the President to provide to Congress the information that we should have had at the outset, including, Mr. Speaker, what are the political and military objectives of the United States in Libya? How do we intend to achieve them? What specific commitments have we made to our NATO operations, and how might these impact our commitments in Afghanistan? And what is the anticipated scope, the duration, and the anticipated cost of continued U.S. military involvement in Libya? What is the relationship between opposition forces that are grouped under the Interim Transitional National Council and the Muslim Brotherhood, the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group, Al-Qaeda, Hezbollah, and other extremist groups? How well armed are these and other extremist groups, and how extensive are their activities in Libya? Who controls thousands of shoulder-fired anti-aircraft missiles and stocks of chemical weapons that Gaddafi has acquired? Finally, Mr. Speaker, this resolution bluntly states that the President has neither sought nor received authorization by the Congress for the continued involvement of the United States Armed Forces in Libya. If this clear warning doesn't get the attention at the White House, then more forceful action may be inevitable. The President can choose to act with the support of Congress and with the support of the American people, but he will not be allowed to proceed without it. I urge my colleagues to vote for this strong and necessary resolution, and with that, I am pleased to yield 1 minute to the distinguished Speaker of the House of Representatives, Mr. Boehner of Ohio.
The gentleman from Ohio is recognized for 1 minute.
Let me thank my colleague for yielding. In March, when the President committed our troops to NATO's mission in Libya, I said that he had a responsibility to the American people to define the mission, to explain what America's role was in achieving that mission, and lay out how it was to be accomplished. He has not effectively done so. And the American people and the members of this House have questions and concerns that have gone unanswered. The President of the United States is our Commander-in-Chief, and I've always believed that combat decisions should be left to the Commander-in-Chief and to the generals on the ground. But the House also has an obligation to heed the concerns of our constituents and to carry out our constitutional responsibilities. The resolution I have put forward expresses the will of the people in a responsible way that reflects our commitments to our troops and to our allies. And let me lay out exactly what this resolution does. First, it establishes that the President has not asked for and that the Congress has not granted authorization for the introduction or continued involvement of our troops in Libya. Second, it reasserts Congress's constitutional role to fund our troops. Third, it requires the President to provide within 14 days information on that mission that should have been provided from the start. And lastly, it reaffirms the vote that we took last week that says there should be no troops on the ground in Libya. I hope the President will recognize his obligations outlined in this resolution and provide this information to Congress, and in so doing so, better communicate to the American people what our mission in Libya is and how it will be achieved. The resolution offered by my colleague from Ohio, Mr. Kucinich, conveys the concerns of the American people, but it also mandates a precipitous withdrawal from our role in supporting our NATO allies in Libya. In my opinion, that would undermine our troops and our allies, which could have serious consequences for our broader national security. In my view, the gentleman's resolution goes too far. We may have differences regarding how we got here, but we cannot turn our backs on our troops and our NATO partners who have stuck by us over the last 10 years. In 1991, my first vote as a member of this body was to authorize the use of force in the first Gulf War. It was a consequential time, but I think we did the right thing. And today is no different. And on behalf of the American people in our country, we have an obligation to support our troops in harm's way and to support our allies. This resolution puts the President on notice. He has a chance to get this right. And if he doesn't, Congress will exercise its constitutional authority and we will make it right. So I would urge a yes on my resolution and a no on the Kucinich resolution, and I yield back.
Yields back his time.
Our time.
Gentlelady from Florida reserves her time. Gentleman from California.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection, so ordered. Gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I rise in opposition to this resolution. If the members of the House choose to pass the Speaker's one-chamber resolution, it should add one finding, that we declare ourselves to be one big, constitutionally created potted plant. This resolution casts all kinds of aspersions on the President. It states the President has failed to provide Congress with a compelling rationale for operations in Libya. It implies that there has been a withholding of documents and information from this body. Could the President provide more information to the Congress? Of course. But we need to look not just at the President's failure to seek an authorization, but the refusal of this body to exercise its authority in this area. The onus rests with us to exercise the sacred duty of authorizing the use of force. A resolution like this, with no operative language, with no invocation of the War Powers Resolution, and which was presented to members for the first time just 14 hours ago, simply perpetuates a dynamic of congressional acquiescence, and acquiescence that for the most part has gone on truly since the Korean War. There are two choices here. If the majority thinks that the President's initial efforts to stop a humanitarian catastrophe were wrong, or that current operations in Libya do not have a compelling national security rationale, it should support Mr. Kucinich's approach and offer a concurrent resolution pursuant to Section 5C of the War Powers Resolution requiring the removal of U.S. forces. If the majority has concerns with Mr. Kucinich's approach, as many of us do, and believes terminating military action would have grave consequences for U.S. national security, it should simply authorize the use of force in Libya, incorporating the restrictions on ground forces that this resolution has, that the Conyers language on the DOD bill had. I would gladly join the Speaker in co-sponsoring such an authorization of the limited use of force. But pursuing a non-binding House resolution that takes potshots at the President and amounts to nothing more than a sense of the Congress is just an exercise in political gamesmanship. It is a pedantic effort to embarrass the President without taking any ownership for the policy of the intervention. The majority, not the President, puts this body in a position of powerlessness through such toothless efforts. We are 60 days into this operation. Either we should authorize this action or terminate, not play around with reporting requirements. The resolution is also confusing. It states that the President shall not deploy or maintain the presence of U.S. military units on the ground in Libya. But as the majority well knows, U.S. military activities are limited to air operations and nothing more. So does the language mean the majority is okay with the current intervention in Libya? The majority seems to be raising a fuss while winking at the White House. That's not the way to legislate. Finally, I object to the resolution because it is downright inaccurate. The resolution implies that there is no compelling national security rationale for the operations in Libya. But U.S. interests are clear. They have been forcefully articulated by the administration, like Bill Kristol. We are in Libya because we are averting a probable massacre against civilians. We are in Libya because our NATO partners need our help. Refusal to act there would send a message to our NATO allies who are putting their forces on the line in Afghanistan that we are not a dependable partner. We are in Libya because our friends struggling for democracy in the Middle East are watching events there. If we fail to act, or worse, seek withdrawal today, what would we be saying to the activists in Tunisia and Egypt, whose fragile movements for democracy could be stifled by the destabilizing effect of a Gaddafi-led government remaining in power? And what message would we be sending to Assad and the other dictators and enemies about our staying power? Let's not kid ourselves. A Gaddafi who is unleashed to commit acts of terrorism around the world will do so with unspeakable barbarity. We know Gaddafi's record of bloodshed. We know his readiness to use terror, especially now that he has nothing to lose. I cannot think of a more compelling rationale for current operations in Libya. I object to the characterization that U.S. national security interests and humanitarian objectives are incompatible. In Libya, it is quite clear that stopping murder and preventing a refugee crisis very much correspond with U.S. national interests. The Republican sponsors of this resolution are trying to have it both ways. They want to criticize the President for taking the very action that many of them called for 3 months ago, and they want to do so without taking any responsibility. In the process, they're offering nothing but criticism and obstruction and endless second-guessing. President Bush once accused the Democratic Party of becoming the party of cut and run. Well, it seems the running shoe is now on the other foot. It is a Democratic president that is taking on a brutal tyrant, and it is the Republican Party that refuses to back him. I urge my colleagues to take seriously U.S. military involvement in Libya and vote no on this resolution.
Does the gentleman reserve?
I reserve the balance of my
Gentleman
time.
reserves the balance of his time. Gentlelady from Florida.
Madam Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend their remarks and include extraneous material on House Resolution 292 and House Con Res 51. And with that, Madam Speaker, I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Indiana, Mr. Burton, the chairman on the Foreign Affairs Subcommittee on Europe and Eurasia.
I thank the gentlelady for yielding.
Recognized for 2 minutes.
Let me just say that the Constitution of the United States and the War Powers Act prohibit the President from doing what he did. And I'm kind of torn because I stayed up late last night thinking about this whole issue. I believe that we shouldn't have gone into Libya in the first place, and we certainly shouldn't go into Syria or other place without the authorization of the Congress of the United States. And that's the reason why I co-sponsored the Kucinich resolution, because we have to send a very strong signal that we're not going to go to war without the people of this country supporting it. And the President did this unilaterally after talking to the Arab League and the UN and others without the consent of the people of this country. That's the first thing. The second thing is the Boehner resolution I'm going to support, but it doesn't go far enough. As far as it goes, it's fine. But it talks only about boots on the ground. And most of the wars in which we've been involved are fought in the air with drones and missiles and airplanes. And we've got about 2/3 of the missiles and over half of the sorties flown by the airplane that are involved in this war. Over 2/3 of those are used by the United States. This is an American conflict. And so when we talk about boots on the ground, that's not sufficient. Now, I'm going to support it as far as it goes because the Speaker is trying to move this in the right direction. But we shouldn't just limit this to boots on the ground. It should involve no military operation whatsoever without the consent of the Congress and the people of this country. And when the Speaker says boots on the ground only, unless we're going in to save one of our troops that are downed in an air fight or shot down when they go in on a bombing run, then that in effect is putting boots on the ground anyhow to get those people out of there. So I will support the Boehner resolution, but I prefer the Kucinich resolution because it sends a very strong signal and tells the President in no uncertain terms that he cannot take us to war without the consent of the people of this country.
Gentleman from California.